Welcome to your Daily 5 for Tuesday, March 21st, 2023. People who've been listening for a while will know that I generally don't do negative movie reviews anymore. I try not to talk about movies if I don't think that I could recommend them to at least some small group of people. But every once in a while there's an exception to that, and today is one of those. It's from 1980, and it's called Hell of the Living Dead, directed by names that should be familiar based on some other reviews I've done, Bruno Mattei and Claudio Fragasso. Now, the movie itself, if you were to just look at it, overall, it's a ripoff of George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, more or less. I mean, you can see the elements of Dawn of the Dead all over this thing. It's fairly straightforward, at least until the very end of the movie, in terms of what the plot is. There is a corporation or a chemical factory that's working on something. There's a leak, and the leak causes people to turn to zombies, and the zombies break out and eat everybody. And that's kind of what the movie is for 90 to 95% of its runtime. And if that's all it was, I really probably wouldn't even be talking about it, because the movie itself, it has a couple of things that really bring it down. It's the beginning and the end they're not necessarily terrible, at least not in terms of this genre itself. They start from kind of a lower baseline. They're not the worst things I've ever seen, but they are fairly dull. And then in the middle, and the middle is one of these things where I didn't know this going in, or I probably never would have watched it to begin with. The middle is intercut with actual documentary footage showing dead bodies, dead animals being disemboweled, and actual cannibalism. People consuming the flesh of dead members of their tribes from an actual documentary. It's very clear when that footage shows up because it's so much worse looking than everything else. It actually makes the rest of it look really pristine. And I didn't know it was in there. So that right there for a lot of people would probably immediately disbar it from ever being watched. Now, if you do want to watch it, it is on Amazon Prime, so you can watch it for free. You don't actually have to spend anything for it. But again, I don't know that I would even recommend it, except for this one thing. And this one thing is so interesting and genuinely feels like something that George Romero himself would have been interested in exploring, that it makes the movie worth at least talking about. So once you get to the end of the movie, and the SWAT team that's sent to this country to find out what happened at this chemical plant, they discover that this chemical, the reason for it existing, the research was for industrialized nations that were trying to thin the population of the globe by exposing third world countries to this chemical so that they would eat themselves and kill themselves. Now that is a brutally dystopian concept, and one that genuinely, again, feels like something that George Romero might have actually done in one of his movies. That particular plot element is so interesting and clever that it almost justifies the rest of the movie. Now, I can't honestly tell you it does, because, again, the parts of the movie that are outright disgusting, which is the documentary stuff, are still dull. There isn't really much that I can recommend. The effects aren't very good. And there's not a lot of gore, which is what you'd want out of a zombie film. And then you get to the middle where there's actual human gore, which is really disheartening and depressing and sad. And so the movie really just fails at a lot of different levels. But that plot point, the reason for the chemical being made, that's something, a lot of times I'll talk about movies and I'll say, if somebody could take this and make a movie out of it, there's a potentially interesting movie in here. That particular part of it, that 3 to 4% of the movie, maybe not even that much, is so compelling, so legitimately compelling in what you could do with that as a storytelling technique, that I had to actually mention it. Because I do think it is something that stands out in the middle of, well, not in the middle, at the very bottom of a movie that otherwise is dull at best and frankly disgusting at worst. And really, that's, again, I'm talking about a movie I really wouldn't recommend for most people, but the reason I'm talking about it is because that one plot point, I think, does feel like the one genuinely Romero element that they ripped off or borrowed from the Romero films. Nothing else about them they got right, but that one thing is interesting, and it's compelling enough that I think it makes the movie worth talking about. So I can't necessarily recommend you watch it, but I do find it interesting what that plot point was. So that's the review. I know it's a weird one, and I know it's not necessarily positive or negative, but that's what it is. Later.